In the winter of 1682, as snow fell silent over Stockholm's royal palace, a child was born who would shake the foundations of Europe. The infant's cry echoed through halls where his ancestors had ruled for generations, but none could foresee that this baby would grow to lead armies before he could legally marry, would march his soldiers across frozen rivers and burning steppes, would become both the terror and admiration of crowned heads from London to Constantinople. They called him Karl, after his grandfather Charles X, who had conquered Denmark and marched across the frozen Baltic Sea. But the world would know him as Charles XII, the Lion of the North, the last of the Viking kings. On that December morning, as candles flickered in the royal chambers and courtiers whispered prayers for the newborn prince, Sweden stood at the height of its power. The Baltic Sea was a Swedish lake. Finnish forests provided timber for the navy. German provinces sent tribute to Stockholm. The Swedish Empire stretched from the Arctic Circle to the plains of northern Germany, a Protestant bulwark against Catholic Europe, a military machine that had humbled emperors and terrified tsars. But empires, like the men who rule them, are fragile things. And this child, sleeping peacefully in his golden cradle, would inherit both the glory and the burden of Swedish greatness. His father, Charles XI, had spent 20 years consolidating royal power, transforming Sweden from a feudal kingdom into an absolute monarchy. The nobility had been tamed, their estates confiscated, their ancient privileges dissolved. The army had been reorganized, with professional officers replacing amateur aristocrats. The treasury had been filled through careful administration and the exploitation of conquered territories. Yet for all his father's reforms, young Charles would grow up in a court that remained distinctly Swedish in character. Unlike the Baroque splendor of Versailles or the ornate ceremonies of Vienna, the Swedish court retained an austere, almost military atmosphere. Courtiers dressed simply, spoke plainly, and valued action over eloquence. The king was first among equals rather than a divine figure set apart from mortal men. This atmosphere would shape the boy profoundly, instilling in him a distaste for luxury, a love of direct action, and an almost religious devotion to duty. His childhood passed quietly in the shadow of greater events. In France, Louis XIV revoked the Edict of Nantes, driving Protestant refugees across Europe. In England, James II fell from his throne, replaced by William of Orange in a bloodless revolution that would reshape the balance of European power. In Vienna, Turkish armies besieged the Habsburg capital before being driven back by Polish cavalry and Austrian determination. But in Sweden there was peace. The boy learned to read Latin and German, to dance the formal steps required at court, to handle weapons with the skill expected of a prince. His tutors found him an eager but willful student. He absorbed military history with particular enthusiasm, studying the campaigns of Alexander, Caesar, and Gustavus Adolphus with the intensity of a professional soldier. Mathematics came easily to him, as did geography and languages. But he showed little interest in philosophy or literature, preferring concrete facts to abstract speculation. Even as a child, he displayed the characteristics that would define his adult personality. He was direct in speech, impatient with ceremony, and utterly focused once his attention was engaged. The Swedish nobility watched the prince's development with growing concern. His father's absolutist policies had reduced their power dramatically, but they hoped the son might prove more pliable than his predecessor. They were disappointed. Even as a boy, Charles showed little inclination to share power or seek consensus. He listened politely to advice but made his own decisions. He treated all men as equals, whether they were dukes or common soldiers, which scandalized the court but endeared him to the army. His military education began early and in earnest. Swedish officers, veterans of campaigns in Poland, Germany, and Denmark, taught him the arts of war with professional thoroughness. He learned to ride before he could properly walk, to handle a sword before he reached his 10th birthday. But more importantly, he absorbed the Swedish military tradition. Swedish armies had dominated European battlefields for nearly a century through superior discipline, innovative tactics, and absolute commitment to victory. Swedish soldiers advanced in perfect formation, fired in coordinated volleys, and charged with the fury of berserkers. They expected their officers to lead from the front, to share their hardships, and to die before retreating. The boy internalized these lessons completely. By his 12th birthday, he could outride most courtiers, outshoot professional marksmen, and discuss military tactics with experienced generals. But his education was not merely practical. Swedish military culture emphasized moral as well as physical courage. A Swedish officer was expected to keep his word regardless of consequences, to protect his men even at the cost of his own life, and to face death with stoic acceptance. These were not merely professional requirements but moral imperatives that shaped every aspect of a soldier's character. As Charles approached his 15th birthday, political circumstances began to change dramatically. His father's health, never robust, deteriorated rapidly during the harsh winter of 1696. Court physicians prescribed various treatments, but it became increasingly clear that the king was dying. The succession, which had seemed a distant concern, suddenly became an immediate crisis. Sweden's enemies, who had remained quiet during Charles XI's reign, began to stir. In Russia, the young Tsar Peter was modernizing his army with German advisors. In Denmark, King Frederick was rebuilding his navy. In Saxony, the Elector Augustus was consolidating his position as King of Poland. These developments did not escape the attention of Swedish intelligence agents, who reported growing coordination among Sweden's traditional enemies. Secret negotiations were conducted in Copenhagen, Moscow, and Dresden. Military preparations increased throughout the region. It seemed clear that Sweden's enemies were waiting for the old king to die before launching a coordinated attack on the Swedish Empire. Charles XI died on April 5, 1697, after a brief illness that left him little time for final preparations. On his deathbed, he extracted promises from his ministers to serve his son faithfully, but he had no time to prepare the boy for the enormous responsibilities that would soon fall upon his shoulders. The 15-year-old prince became King Charles XII of Sweden in a ceremony that was both magnificent and ominous. The crown that was placed upon his head had been worn by conquerors and empire builders, but it was also heavy with the weight of expectation and the burden of impending war. The new king's minority was to be guided by a regency council composed of experienced ministers who had served his father loyally. But Charles showed little inclination to accept their guidance passively. From the moment of his coronation, he insisted on being consulted on all major decisions. He attended council meetings regularly, asking pointed questions and challenging conventional wisdom with a directness that startled veteran administrators. It quickly became apparent that this was no ordinary 15-year-old boy, but a young man with fixed opinions and an iron will. His first major decision concerned military preparations. Intelligence reports indicated that Sweden's enemies were forming a coalition designed to partition the Swedish Empire. The Regency Council favored diplomatic solutions, hoping to divide Sweden's enemies through negotiation and compromise. But Charles advocated a different approach. He believed that Sweden's best defense lay in military strength and the willingness to use it decisively. He ordered the mobilization of additional troops, the strengthening of frontier fortifications, and increased surveillance of enemy activities. These preparations proved prescient. Throughout 1698 and 1699, evidence mounted that a great coalition was forming against Sweden. Russian diplomats worked tirelessly to coordinate military planning among Sweden's enemies. Danish agents recruited German mercenaries. Saxon troops massed on the Polish border. By early 1700, it was clear that war was inevitable. The only question was when and where the first blow would fall. Charles spent these months in intensive preparation. He studied maps of every Swedish province, memorized the strength and disposition of every military unit, and consulted with officers who had served in previous campaigns. But more importantly, he prepared himself psychologically for the ordeal ahead. He knew that he would be fighting not just for territory or political advantage, but for the very survival of the Swedish Empire. The enemies arrayed against him controlled vastly superior resources. Russia alone had 10 times Sweden's population. The coalition possessed overwhelming numerical superiority in both men and money. But Charles believed that these disadvantages could be overcome through superior leadership, better training, and absolute commitment to victory. Swedish soldiers had prevailed against similar odds in the past through discipline, courage, and tactical innovation. The boy king was determined to prove that these traditions remained alive in the new century. As 1700 dawned, the young king made a decision that would define his entire reign. Rather than waiting for his enemies to attack, he would strike first. Rather than fighting defensively on multiple fronts, he would concentrate his forces and defeat his enemies one by one. Rather than seeking compromise, he would pursue total victory. It was a bold strategy that reflected both his supreme confidence and his complete understanding of Sweden's military tradition. The child who had been born in the peaceful winter of 1682 was gone forever. In his place stood a warrior king, 18 years old and utterly determined to preserve the empire his ancestors had built. He could not know that the coming war would last for 2 decades, would consume entire armies, and would ultimately transform the map of Northern Europe. He could not foresee that he would march his soldiers from the Baltic to the Black Sea, would win victories that would echo through history, and would die on a remote battlefield far from the palace where he had been born. But on that March morning in 1700, as he reviewed his troops and prepared for war, Charles XII of Sweden was ready for whatever fate might bring. The Lion of the North was about to show his claws to a world that had underestimated the power of Swedish steel and the determination of a boy who had been born to rule an empire. Part 2. The Great Northern War begins, 1700 to 1702. The storm broke in February 1700, not with thunder and lightning, but with the quiet rustle of diplomatic papers and the measured tread of marching men. King Frederick IV of Denmark struck first, crossing the border into Holstein-Gottorp, Sweden's German ally. It was a calculated insult, designed to draw Swedish forces away from more vital theaters. But Charles saw through the deception immediately. Denmark was the weakest member of the coalition, isolated on its peninsula and dependent on naval supremacy for security. If Sweden could eliminate Denmark quickly, it would free resources for the greater struggles to come. The 18-year-old king's response shocked European capitals with its audacity and speed. Rather than dividing his forces among multiple threats, Charles concentrated the entire Swedish navy and a substantial army for an immediate assault on Denmark. The plan was breathtakingly risky. It meant leaving the Baltic provinces virtually undefended while Russian and Saxon armies prepared their own attacks. But Charles understood that in war, as in chess, bold moves often succeed precisely because they seem impossible. The Swedish fleet sailed from Stockholm in late July, carrying 16,000 soldiers across waters that had been Swedish for half a century. The Baltic Sea in summer was deceptively peaceful, its blue waters sparkling under the northern sun. But beneath this tranquil surface lay the bones of countless warriors who had fought for control of these strategic waters. Danish warships shadowed the Swedish convoy, but they were outnumbered and outgunned by the Swedish navy that had dominated Baltic waters since the days of Gustavus Adolphus. Charles stood on the deck of his flagship, studying the Danish coastline through a telescope. The young king wore a simple blue uniform, indistinguishable from those of his officers except for the silver star of the Order of the Seraphim on his chest. His pale blue eyes, so characteristic of the Vasa dynasty, remained fixed on the shore where his enemies waited. He had studied every map of Zealand, every report of Danish fortifications, every detail of the terrain where he would soon fight his first battle as king. The landing at Hummelbæk on August 4, 1700, marked Charles's transformation from theoretical strategist to battlefield commander. As Swedish longboats approached the Danish shore, enemy artillery opened fire from concealed positions among the sand dunes. Cannonballs splashed into the surf around the boats, sending geysers of seawater high into the air. But the Swedish soldiers, veterans of garrison duty and training exercises, maintained their formation with the discipline that had made Swedish arms feared throughout Europe. Charles was among the first to leap into the shallow water, his boots splashing through foam tinged red with blood from wounded soldiers. A Danish cannonball struck the sand near his feet, showering him with grit and fragments. But he continued forward without breaking stride. His officers, trained from childhood to follow their king's example, surged after him with a roar that carried clearly over the sound of gunfire and crashing waves. The Battle of Hummelbæk lasted only 3 hours, but it established patterns that would define Charles's entire military career. The Swedish infantry advanced in perfect formation despite heavy casualties, their blue uniforms clearly visible against the pale sand of the Danish coast. Swedish artillery, dragged from the boats by teams of soldiers and horses, unlimbered on the beach and began counter-battery fire with the precision that marked Swedish gunnery throughout the war. But most importantly, Charles led from the front, sharing the dangers faced by his men and inspiring them through personal example rather than distant commands. The Danish defenders, primarily militia units stiffened by a few regular battalions, fought with the desperation of men defending their homeland. But they lacked the training and discipline of their Swedish opponents. When the Swedish infantry began their final assault, bayonets fixed and colors flying, the Danish line wavered and broke. Within minutes, what had been an organized defense became a rout, with Danish soldiers streaming back toward Copenhagen in disorder. The psychological impact of this victory extended far beyond the immediate tactical situation. European courts had expected the young Swedish king to prove inexperienced and indecisive when faced with his first military crisis. Instead, he had demonstrated strategic vision, tactical competence, and personal courage that recalled the great Swedish commanders of the previous century. French ambassadors reported to Versailles that the boy king fought like a seasoned veteran. English observers noted his calm demeanor under fire. Even his enemies began to speak of him with grudging respect. But Charles allowed himself little time for celebration. While his soldiers consolidated their beachhead and prepared for the advance on Copenhagen, the king was already planning the next phase of his campaign. Danish resistance on Zealand collapsed with surprising speed as Swedish columns advanced along roads that had seen no foreign invaders for generations. Peasants fled from their villages, driving cattle and carrying household goods in carts that clogged the roads. The Danish army, demoralized by defeat and hampered by poor leadership, offered only token resistance as Swedish forces approached the capital. The siege of Copenhagen began on August 12 with Swedish artillery positions established on the heights overlooking the city. Charles established his headquarters in a commandeered farmhouse, where maps covered every available surface and messengers arrived hourly with reports from scouts and intelligence agents. The young king slept little during these crucial weeks, working by candlelight to coordinate the complex logistics required to maintain an army in enemy territory while preparing for the inevitable counterattacks that would come from other members of the coalition. Copenhagen's defenses, designed to repel attacks from the land, proved inadequate against Swedish siege techniques refined during decades of continental warfare. Swedish engineers, trained in the mathematical principles of fortification and siegecraft, approached the problem with scientific precision. Parallels and approaches were dug according to textbook procedures, while artillery bombardments systematically reduced the city's defensive capabilities. But Charles's greatest weapon was not gunpowder or engineering skill, but diplomacy backed by military success. As Swedish cannons pounded Copenhagen's walls and Danish resistance crumbled, neutral powers began to intervene. England and the Dutch Republic, alarmed by the prospect of Swedish dominance in the Baltic, offered to mediate a peace settlement. More importantly, they made it clear that continued Swedish aggression might provoke their own intervention on Denmark's behalf. The Treaty of Trevendel, signed on August 18, 1700, represented a masterpiece of strategic calculation. Charles could have continued the siege and almost certainly captured Copenhagen, but at enormous cost in time and resources. Instead, he accepted terms that eliminated Denmark from the coalition while preserving Swedish strength for greater challenges ahead. Denmark agreed to remain neutral for the duration of the war, to restore all conquered territory to Holstein-Gottorp, and to recognize Swedish supremacy in the Baltic. In return, Charles withdrew his army intact and available for immediate redeployment against Russia and Saxony. The speed and completeness of this victory sent shockwaves throughout Northern Europe. In Moscow, Tsar Peter received news of Denmark's defeat with consternation that bordered on panic. The Russian ruler had expected the Swedish army to be tied down in Denmark for months, possibly years. Instead, Charles had eliminated one member of the coalition in less than 6 weeks and was now free to concentrate his full attention on the Eastern theater. But Peter, despite his alarm, was not prepared to abandon his own plans for conquest. The young Tsar had spent years modernizing his army with foreign advisors and Western equipment. He believed that Russian numerical superiority would eventually prevail, regardless of Swedish tactical advantages. More importantly, he had already committed himself to war by laying siege to the Swedish fortress of Narva in October 1700. The siege of Narva presented Charles with his greatest challenge to date. The fortress, guarding Sweden's eastern frontier, was considered virtually impregnable. Its walls, designed by Swedish engineers and strengthened over decades of construction, incorporated the latest advances in military architecture. The garrison, commanded by Colonel Rudolf Horn, consisted of veteran soldiers who had sworn to defend the position to their deaths. But Narva was also isolated, cut off from reinforcement by the vast distances of the Baltic provinces and the onset of winter. Russian forces surrounding Narva numbered nearly 40,000 men, equipped with artillery cast in Moscow's foundries and organized according to Western military principles. Peter himself had come to supervise the siege, bringing with him a staff of foreign officers and the determination to prove that his military reforms had transformed Russia into a modern European power. The contrast with previous Russian armies was striking. Gone were the irregular cavalry and feudal militia that had characterized Muscovite warfare. In their place stood battalions of infantry drilled in European tactics, artillery units commanded by experienced gunners, and cavalry regiments organized along Western lines. Charles's response to the Russian threat demonstrated the strategic insight that would characterize his entire career. Rather than attempting to relieve Narva directly, he chose to strike at the Russian communications and supply lines that sustained their army in this remote frontier region. Swedish forces, moving with the mobility that had always been their greatest asset, began a series of raids designed to isolate the Russian besiegers and force them to fight on Swedish terms. The march from Denmark to the Baltic provinces required extraordinary logistical coordination. Swedish soldiers, fresh from their victory over Denmark, had to be transported by ship across the Baltic Sea and then marched through forests and swamps that would have challenged medieval armies. Supplies had to be accumulated, weapons distributed, and local defenses organized while maintaining absolute secrecy about Swedish intentions. Charles himself seemed to thrive on these challenges. The young king rode with his advance guards, slept in the same rough shelters as his soldiers, and shared their rations during the grueling march eastward. His officers, initially skeptical of their boy king's military abilities, began to develop the fierce personal loyalty that would sustain Swedish arms through decades of warfare. They saw that Charles demanded no privilege for himself that he did not extend to his men, that he studied every detail of their profession with the intensity of a scholar, and that he faced danger with the calm courage of a veteran commander. The Swedish army that approached Narva in November 1700 was small by the standards of the age, numbering barely 10,000 men. But it was perfectly trained, superbly equipped, and led by officers who understood their trade thoroughly. More importantly, it was inspired by a king who had already proven himself in battle and who seemed to regard the overwhelming Russian superiority in numbers as merely another tactical problem to be solved through superior leadership and fighting skill. The Battle of Narva, fought on November 30th, 1700, would establish Charles XII as one of the great military commanders of European history. But it would also begin a pattern of victories so complete and dramatic that they would ultimately lead to overconfidence and strategic miscalculation. The 18-year-old king who prepared for battle in the forests outside Narva could not know that his greatest triumph would also mark the beginning of his eventual downfall. Part 3. The Battle of Narva and Early Victories, 1700 to 1704. The morning of November 30th dawned gray and bitter, with snow falling steadily through the pine forests that surrounded Narva. The temperature had dropped well below freezing during the night, turning the muddy roads into ribbons of ice and covering the Russian earthworks with a thin white shroud. In their camps outside the fortress, 40,000 Russian soldiers huddled around fires that seemed to provide no warmth, their breath forming clouds in the frigid air as they prepared weapons and checked equipment with hands that could barely grip their muskets. Charles had spent the pre-dawn hours riding through the Swedish positions, speaking quietly with his officers and soldiers. The young king wore a simple gray cloak over his blue uniform, with snow gathering on his shoulders as he moved from regiment to regiment. His face, pale in the early light, showed no trace of nervousness or doubt. He had studied the Russian positions for days, probing their defenses with small detachments and gathering intelligence from deserters and captured prisoners. Now he was ready to attempt what many of his advisors considered impossible: a direct assault on an enemy force that outnumbered his own army 4-1. The Swedish plan of attack was audacious in its simplicity. Rather than attempting a prolonged siege or waiting for reinforcements that might never come, Charles had decided to attack the Russian camp directly. The enemy had grown careless during their long siege of Narva, allowing their defensive lines to become extended and poorly coordinated. More importantly, Tsar Peter had departed the previous day for Moscow, leaving his army under the command of foreign officers who lacked both experience and authority. At 11 o'clock in the morning, as the snowfall intensified into a proper blizzard, Charles gave the signal for the attack to begin. Swedish artillery, positioned on the heights overlooking the Russian camp, opened fire with a precision that contrasted sharply with the wild shooting that had characterized earlier exchanges. Each gun had been carefully aimed at specific targets: command posts, ammunition dumps, and the wooden palisades that protected the Russian earthworks. The bombardment lasted exactly 1 hour, long enough to create panic and confusion but not so long as to exhaust Swedish ammunition supplies. The infantry assault began at noon, launched through driving snow that reduced visibility to mere yards. Swedish soldiers advanced in 2 columns, each consisting of approximately 4,000 men organized into battalions that had trained together for years. They moved with the mechanical precision of clockwork, maintaining their formation despite the treacherous footing and the storm that seemed to muffle all sound except the steady tramp of their boots and the occasional bark of orders from their officers. The right column, commanded by General Carl Gustav Renskold, struck the Russian positions near the river, where the enemy's earthworks were strongest, but their attention was focused on the fortress they had been besieging for weeks. The left column, led by Charles himself, attacked the Russian center where their command structure was located. Both assaults benefited from the weather, which concealed Swedish movements until the attackers were almost upon their enemies. The first Russian soldiers to see the Swedish attack could hardly believe their eyes. Through the swirling snow emerged ranks of blue-uniformed infantry moving with the relentless pace of a machine. Swedish officers, their swords drawn and their voices carrying clearly despite the wind, maintained perfect order as their men climbed the earthworks and poured into the Russian camp. Behind the infantry came Swedish cavalry, their horses' hooves thundering on the frozen ground as they exploited gaps created by the foot soldiers. The fighting that followed was brief but extraordinarily violent. Russian resistance collapsed with shocking speed as panic spread through units that had never faced professional European troops in battle. Soldiers who had spent weeks in relative safety behind their earthworks found themselves engaged in desperate hand-to-hand combat with Swedish veterans who showed neither fear nor mercy. The language barrier between Russian officers and their foreign commanders created additional confusion, as orders given in German or French were misunderstood or ignored entirely. Charles fought in the front ranks throughout the battle, his sword bloody and his uniform torn by enemy fire. Several times his officers tried to persuade him to withdraw to a safer position, but the young king refused to leave his soldiers while the fighting continued. He seemed to possess an almost supernatural ability to appear wherever the fighting was fiercest, rallying wavering units and leading charges that broke enemy resistance. His personal example inspired Swedish soldiers to feats of courage that became legendary, while his presence on the battlefield created a moral ascendancy that proved more valuable than numerical superiority. The collapse of Russian resistance began in the center, where Charles's column had penetrated deepest into the enemy camp. Russian soldiers, seeing their command posts overrun and their officers killed or captured, began to retreat toward the river. This withdrawal quickly became a rout as unit cohesion dissolved and every man began looking to his own safety. The retreat turned into a catastrophe when thousands of Russian soldiers attempted to cross the Narva River on a temporary bridge that collapsed under their weight, drowning hundreds in the icy water. By 4 o'clock in the afternoon, the battle was over. The Russian army that had besieged Narva for months had ceased to exist as an organized force. Nearly 10,000 Russian soldiers lay dead in the snow, while another 20,000 had been captured or dispersed. Swedish casualties numbered fewer than 700 men, a disproportion so extreme that many European observers initially refused to believe the reports. The military reputation that Russia had been building under Peter's leadership was destroyed in a single afternoon. While Sweden's position as the dominant military power in Northern Europe seemed more secure than ever, the immediate aftermath of Narva revealed Charles's character as clearly as the battle itself. While his soldiers celebrated their victory and divided the enormous quantities of supplies and equipment captured from the Russians, the young king was already planning his next campaign. He showed no interest in the wealth that victory had brought him, distributing captured Russian treasure among his officers and soldiers while keeping nothing for himself except the military intelligence that would guide his future operations. The strategic implications of Narva extended far beyond the immediate military situation. In Moscow, news of the disaster created panic among Peter's advisors and courtiers. The Tsar's military reforms, which had consumed enormous resources and required years of preparation, appeared to have been wasted. The foreign officers whom Peter had recruited at great expense were dead, captured, or discredited. The modern army that was supposed to transform Russia into a European power had proved no match for Swedish military traditions that dated back to Gustavus Adolphus. But Peter, despite his shock and disappointment, refused to abandon his ambitions. The young Tsar recognized that his defeat at Narva, humiliating though it was, had also provided valuable lessons about the requirements of modern warfare. Russian soldiers had fought bravely when properly led, and Russian resources remained vastly superior to Sweden's. What was needed was not a different strategy but better execution of existing plans. Charles, meanwhile, faced a crucial strategic decision. The complete destruction of Russian military power in the Baltic provinces created opportunities for decisive action that might end the war quickly and favorably. He could march on Moscow itself, exploiting Russian demoralization and the approach of winter that would protect his army from counterattack. Alternatively, he could turn his attention to Saxony and Poland, where Augustus the Strong was preparing his own assault on Swedish territories. The choice Charles made would define the remainder of his reign and ultimately determine the fate of the Swedish Empire. Rather than pursuing the demoralized Russians toward Moscow, he decided to secure his southern flank by eliminating Saxon power in Poland. This decision, which seemed prudent at the time, would eventually prove disastrous. It gave Peter the breathing space he needed to rebuild his army and implement the reforms that would eventually transform Russia into an irresistible military force. The Polish campaign that began in 1701 demonstrated both Charles's tactical brilliance and his growing detachment from political reality. The young king, intoxicated by his victory at Narva and convinced of his own invincibility, began to view warfare not as an instrument of policy but as an end in itself. He seemed to take genuine pleasure in the challenges of campaign life. The long marches through hostile territory, the complex problems of supply and logistics, the intellectual puzzles posed by enemy deployments and defensive positions. The crossing of the Daugava River in July 1701 marked the beginning of 6 years of almost continuous campaigning that would take Swedish armies from the Baltic to the Black Sea. The river, swollen by spring rains and defended by Saxon troops in prepared positions, presented obstacles that would have stopped most commanders. But Charles approached the problem with the methodical patience of an engineer combined with the bold imagination of an artist. Swedish preparations for the river crossing consumed weeks of careful planning and coordination. Boats had to be constructed or requisitioned from local populations. Artillery positions had to be established to suppress enemy fire from the opposite bank. Diversionary attacks had to be organized to confuse Saxon commanders about Swedish intentions. Most importantly, the assault had to be timed to take advantage of weather conditions that would favor Swedish mobility while hampering Saxon defensive efforts. The crossing itself, executed on a foggy morning when visibility was limited to a few hundred yards, succeeded through a combination of careful preparation and Swedish tactical superiority. Advance units, crossing in small boats under cover of artillery fire, established footholds on the Saxon-held bank while the main force prepared to follow. Saxon resistance, initially fierce, crumbled when Charles led a cavalry charge that broke their line and forced them to retreat in disorder. The campaign that followed demonstrated the evolution of Charles's military thinking from the straightforward tactics that had succeeded at Narva to the complex operational concepts that would characterize his mature strategy. Rather than pursuing Saxon armies directly, he began a systematic campaign designed to isolate them from their bases and force them to fight on Swedish terms. Swedish columns moved with unprecedented speed through the Polish countryside, appearing simultaneously in multiple locations and creating the impression of forces far larger than they actually were. Augustus the Strong, faced with Swedish armies that seemed to be everywhere at once, found himself unable to concentrate his forces for decisive battle. Saxon troops, scattered across hundreds of miles of difficult terrain, were defeated in detail by Swedish columns that appeared without warning and vanished before reinforcements could arrive. Polish nobles, traditionally hostile to Saxon authority, began to reconsider their allegiances as Swedish success made it clear that Augustus could not protect his Polish territories from invasion. The Battle of XII, fought on July 19, 1702, marked the climax of Charles's Polish campaign and demonstrated his mastery of the operational art. Saxon and Russian forces, numbering nearly 25,000 men, had concentrated near the town of Klisow in an attempt to block Swedish advances toward Krakow. Augustus himself commanded the Allied army, supported by experienced officers and equipped with artillery that outnumbered Swedish guns by more than 2-1. Charles approached this challenge with the calm confidence that had become his trademark. The Swedish army, numbering barely 12,000 men, was outnumbered but superbly trained and led by officers who had developed complete faith in their king's tactical judgment. More importantly, Swedish morale was at its peak. Victory at Narva and subsequent successes in Poland had convinced Swedish soldiers that they were invincible under Charles's leadership. The battle began at dawn with a Saxon artillery bombardment designed to disrupt Swedish formations and demoralize their soldiers. But Swedish troops, veterans of similar bombardments, maintained their discipline while Swedish gunners replied with the accurate fire that had become their signature. The artillery duel continued for nearly 3 hours, with neither side gaining decisive advantage, before Charles ordered his infantry to advance. The Swedish attack at Klisow demonstrated tactical innovations that would influence European warfare for decades. Rather than advancing in the linear formations favored by most contemporary armies, Swedish battalions moved in columns that could deploy rapidly into line when they reached effective range. This formation provided greater flexibility and allowed Swedish commanders to concentrate force at critical points while maintaining the mobility that had always characterized Swedish tactics. The Saxon line, stretched across nearly 2 miles of front, could not match Swedish concentration and mobility. When Charles led a cavalry charge against the Saxon left wing, their resistance collapsed with the same sudden completeness that had characterized Russian defeat at Narva. Within hours, another enemy army had been destroyed, another reputation shattered, another step taken toward the strategic overextension that would eventually destroy the Swedish Empire. Victory at Klisow opened the road to Warsaw and demonstrated Charles's evolution from promising young commander to military genius of the first rank. But it also marked the beginning of his fatal obsession with military glory at the expense of political wisdom. The 18-year-old who had defeated Denmark through strategic calculation was becoming a 20-year-old who pursued victory for its own sake, regardless of broader consequences. Part 4. The Hunt for Augustus and Polish Campaigns, 1702 to 1706. The autumn of 1702 found Charles XII in Warsaw, master of a city that had fallen to his armies without a siege. The Polish capital, with its Baroque churches and noble palaces, seemed almost untouched by war as Swedish soldiers marched through streets that echoed with the sound of their boots on cobblestone. But beneath this surface calm lay a political situation of extraordinary complexity that would test Charles's abilities as a statesman far more severely than any battlefield had tested his skills as a general. Poland in 1702 was not a kingdom in the conventional sense, but rather a unique political entity governed by an elected monarch whose authority was limited by a noble assembly that could paralyze government through the exercise of individual veto power. Augustus the Strong held the Polish crown not by hereditary right but through election, supported by Russian gold and Saxon military power. His position depended entirely on his ability to protect Polish territories from foreign invasion and to distribute patronage among the noble families who controlled the country's political machinery. Charles's occupation of Warsaw shattered the foundation of Augustus's authority while creating opportunities for Swedish diplomacy that the young king proved remarkably adept at exploiting. Rather than ruling Poland as a conquered territory, Charles presented himself as a liberator who had come to free the Polish people from Saxon oppression and Russian interference. He courted Polish nobles with a combination of military demonstration and political concessions that gradually created a Swedish party within the Polish political system. The Swedish court, established in Warsaw during the winter of 1702 to 1703, bore little resemblance to the formal ceremonies that characterized other European capitals. Charles maintained the austere lifestyle that had marked his entire reign, rising before dawn to review intelligence reports and conduct military planning. He dressed simply, ate the same rations as his soldiers, and showed no interest in the luxury that conquest had placed within his reach. This apparent indifference to material rewards impressed Polish nobles who had grown cynical about the corruption and extravagance of Augustus's administration. But Charles's political strategy extended far beyond personal example. He understood that sustainable control of Poland required legitimate Polish support rather than foreign occupation. Working with Swedish diplomats and sympathetic Polish nobles, he began organizing the political coalition that would eventually elect Stanislaw Leszczynski as Polish king and formal Swedish ally. This process required delicate negotiations with dozens of noble families, each with their own interests and grievances against Saxon rule. The complexity of Polish politics would have challenged the most experienced diplomat, but Charles approached these negotiations with the same systematic thoroughness that characterized his military planning. He studied genealogies of noble families, memorized details of local disputes and alliances, and cultivated relationships with key figures through a combination of personal charm and strategic calculation. Polish nobles, expecting to meet a barbarous Swedish warlord, instead encountered a cultured young king who spoke fluent Latin, understood constitutional law, and demonstrated genuine respect for Polish traditions. Meanwhile, Augustus the Strong was marshaling resources for a counterattack designed to restore Saxon authority and drive Swedish forces from Polish territory. The Saxon king had learned important lessons from his defeats at the hands of Swedish armies. Rather than confronting Charles directly in pitched battle, Augustus adopted a strategy of avoiding decisive engagements while using Saxon mobility and local knowledge to disrupt Swedish supply lines and communications. This guerrilla warfare, conducted primarily by Saxon cavalry and Polish irregulars loyal to Augustus, created new challenges for Swedish military organization. Charles's armies, designed for rapid movement and decisive battle, were less well suited to the prolonged campaigning required to pacify hostile territory. Swedish soldiers, accustomed to victory in conventional engagements, found themselves fighting an elusive enemy who struck without warning and melted away before effective retaliation could be organized. The winter campaign of 1703 demonstrated both the strengths and limitations of Swedish military power when applied to unconventional warfare. Charles divided his army into multiple columns that swept through the Polish countryside, seeking to bring Saxon forces to battle while demonstrating Swedish authority to the civilian population. But Augustus refused to be pinned down, conducting a fighting retreat that drew Swedish forces deeper into Polish territory while stretching their supply lines to the breaking point. The pursuit of Augustus through the forests and marshes of eastern Poland tested Swedish endurance and discipline to their limits. Winter campaigns in this region required extraordinary logistical preparation and presented hazards that could destroy armies without enemy action. Roads became impassable rivers of mud during spring thaws, while sudden temperature drops could freeze soldiers to death in their sleep. Disease, always a threat to armies in the field, spread rapidly among troops weakened by inadequate nutrition and constant exposure to harsh weather. But Swedish soldiers, conditioned by generations of service in northern climates, proved remarkably adaptable to these conditions. They learned to construct shelters from local materials, to forage effectively in hostile territory, and to maintain their weapons and equipment despite constant use and inadequate supplies. More importantly, they maintained the unit cohesion and fighting effectiveness that made them formidable opponents even when operating under the most difficult circumstances. Charles himself seemed to thrive on the challenges of winter campaigning. The young king rode with his advance guards through snow-covered forests, shared his soldiers' rations during forced marches, and slept in the same rough shelters that housed his men. His physical endurance became legendary among both Swedish and enemy forces. Stories circulated of the king marching on foot when his horse collapsed, of his continuing to issue orders despite wounds that would have incapacitated ordinary men, of his apparent immunity to fatigue and discomfort. This personal example proved crucial to Swedish morale during the grinding attrition of the Polish campaigns. Soldiers who might have deserted or surrendered under other commanders maintained their loyalty because they saw that their king shared every hardship and faced every danger alongside them. The relationship between Charles and his army transcended normal military hierarchy, becoming something closer to a brotherhood bound by shared suffering and mutual respect. The Battle of Pultusk, fought on April 21, 1703, marked a turning point in the Polish campaign and demonstrated Charles's growing mastery of operational warfare. Saxon forces, reinforced by Russian troops and Polish irregulars, had concentrated near the town of Pultusk in an attempt to block Swedish advances toward the Russian border. The position was naturally strong, protected by marshes and streams that would channel any attack into narrow frontages where superior numbers could be decisive. Charles approached this challenge with tactical innovations that reflected his evolution as a military commander. Rather than attempting a direct assault on prepared positions, he organized a complex flanking movement designed to cut Saxon communications while forcing them to fight in unfavorable terrain. Swedish engineers, working under enemy observation, constructed bridges and causeways that would allow rapid deployment across the marshy ground that protected the Saxon position. The battle itself began before dawn with a Swedish artillery bombardment that continued for 3 hours, systematically destroying Saxon defensive works and creating panic among troops who had never experienced such accurate and sustained fire. When the Swedish infantry finally advanced, they did so with the precision and coordination that had become their trademark, maintaining formation despite difficult terrain and determined enemy resistance. Saxon collapse at Pultusk followed the pattern established at previous engagements, but the pursuit that followed demonstrated new levels of Swedish operational sophistication. Rather than allowing defeated enemies to escape and regroup, Charles organized coordinated pursuit operations that captured or destroyed entire Saxon units before they could reach safety. Swedish cavalry, reinforced by mounted infantry, maintained contact with retreating enemies for days, preventing them from establishing new defensive positions and completing the destruction of Saxon military power in Poland. The political consequences of Pultusk proved more significant than its immediate military results. Augustus, faced with the systematic destruction of his armies and the collapse of his support among Polish nobles, began to consider negotiating a separate peace with Sweden. Secret communications, conducted through intermediaries and coded messages, explored the possibility of Saxon withdrawal from the coalition in exchange for Swedish recognition of Augustus's retention of his electoral title in Saxony. But Charles, intoxicated by his string of victories and convinced that total victory was within reach, rejected these overtures. He demanded not merely Saxon withdrawal from Poland but Augustus's formal abdication of the Polish crown and acknowledgement of Stanislaw Leszczyński as legitimate king. These terms, which would have represented complete humiliation for Augustus, ensured that the war would continue despite growing war weariness on both sides. The coronation of Stanislaw Leszczyński as King of Poland, conducted in Warsaw on October 4, 1705, marked the apparent culmination of Charles's Polish strategy. The ceremony, attended by Swedish officers and Polish nobles who had abandoned Augustus for the Swedish cause, created a formal alliance between Sweden and Poland that seemed to secure Swedish dominance in Eastern Europe. Leszczyński, a cultured nobleman with impeccable credentials and genuine popular support, appeared to offer the legitimate alternative to Saxon rule that Charles had been seeking. But the new king's position remained precarious, dependent entirely on Swedish military protection and vulnerable to any shift in the military balance. Polish nobles who had supported Leszczyński's election were primarily motivated by opposition to Saxon rule rather than enthusiasm for Swedish alliance. Their loyalty would last only as long as Swedish armies remained victorious and Swedish protection seemed more valuable than accommodation with Augustus. The Siege of Grodno, beginning in January 1706, demonstrated the limitations of Charles's strategy and foreshadowed the disasters that would eventually destroy Swedish power in Eastern Europe. The fortress, defended by Saxon and Russian troops under Augustus's personal command, represented the last major obstacle to complete Swedish control of Poland. Its capture would eliminate organized resistance and force Augustus to accept the humiliating terms that Charles continued to demand. But Grodno also represented a strategic trap that would consume Swedish resources while achieving no decisive strategic advantage. The fortress was strong enough to resist assault but not important enough to justify the enormous costs of a prolonged siege. Augustus, recognizing Swedish intentions, used the siege to buy time for diplomatic initiatives designed to isolate Sweden and rebuild the anti-Swedish coalition. The siege itself followed conventional patterns, with Swedish engineers constructing parallels and approaches according to established procedures, while artillery systematically reduced the fortress's defensive capabilities. But Charles's attention was increasingly focused on grander strategic concepts that extended far beyond the immediate tactical situation. Intelligence reports indicated that Tsar Peter was using the respite provided by Swedish involvement in Poland to rebuild Russian military power and implement reforms that would transform Russia into a formidable opponent. More ominously, diplomatic intelligence suggested that other European powers were beginning to reconsider their neutral stance toward the Great Northern War. France, England, and Austria had initially viewed the conflict as a regional dispute that did not threaten their vital interests. But Swedish victories had upset the European balance of power and created the possibility of Swedish hegemony over Northern and Eastern Europe that major powers could not tolerate. Charles's response to these developing threats revealed both his strategic vision and his fatal overconfidence. Rather than consolidating Swedish gains and seeking a negotiated peace that would preserve Swedish advantages, he began planning operations that would extend Swedish power even further while eliminating all potential threats to Swedish supremacy. The king who had begun the war as a defensive response to coalition aggression was transforming into an expansionist conqueror whose ambitions knew no limits. The capitulation of Grodno in September 1706 marked the end of organized Saxon resistance in Poland and the apparent vindication of Charles's strategy. Augustus, faced with the systematic destruction of his armies and the collapse of his political support, finally agreed to the Treaty of Altenstadt, which represented complete Swedish victory in the Polish theater. The Saxon king formally renounced his claim to the Polish crown, recognized Stanislaw Leszczynski as legitimate ruler, and agreed to pay war reparations that would help finance continued Swedish military operations. But victory in Poland, complete though it appeared, had consumed 6 years of precious time while allowing Sweden's most dangerous enemy to recover and rebuild. Peter the Great, learning from his defeat at Narva and subsequent military disasters, had used Swedish involvement in Poland to implement military reforms that would soon transform the strategic balance in the Baltic region. The Swedish army that had once seemed invincible was about to face challenges that would test its limits and ultimately reveal the impossibility of maintaining Swedish empire against the combined resources of resurgent Russia and hostile Europe. Part 5. The Fatal Decision March into Russia, 1707 to 1708. The winter of 1707 found Charles XII in Saxony, master of Central Europe and arbiter of the continent's destiny. From his headquarters in the palace at Altenstadt, the 25-year-old Swedish king commanded respect and fear from Vienna to Moscow. Emperor Joseph I sought his alliance against France. Louis XIV courted his friendship through diplomatic overtures. Pope Clement XI granted concessions to Swedish Protestants in Silesia. Never before had Swedish power reached such heights, and never again would it come so close to reshaping the map of Europe. But beneath this surface triumph lay strategic realities that would soon shatter Swedish dreams of empire. The army that had marched triumphantly from Denmark to Saxony was showing signs of the strain that 6 years of continuous campaigning had imposed. Veteran regiments that had once numbered 800 men now counted barely 400 effectives. Officers who had begun the war as young lieutenants now commanded battalions through battlefield promotion rather than formal training. Equipment, worn by constant use and inadequate replacement, required constant maintenance and improvisation. More ominously, intelligence reports from the Baltic provinces painted a picture of systematic Russian resurgence that challenged every assumption underlying Swedish strategy. Tsar Peter, rather than retreating into defensive passivity after his humiliating defeats, had used Swedish absence to implement military reforms of unprecedented scope and ambition. Russian foundries now produced artillery superior to Swedish guns. Russian officers, trained by foreign experts and battle-hardened through campaigns against Ottoman forces, displayed competence that recalled the disaster at Narva only as a learning experience. The new Russian army that was taking shape represented a fundamental transformation of Muscovite military culture. Gone were the irregular cavalry and feudal levies that had characterized previous Russian forces. In their place stood professional regiments organized according to Western principles, equipped with modern weapons, and commanded by officers who understood contemporary military science. French engineers had designed new fortifications for Russian cities. German specialists had reorganized Russian supply systems. Dutch naval experts had created a Baltic fleet that challenged Swedish maritime supremacy. Charles received these intelligence reports with characteristic composure, but their implications were clear to anyone who understood the mathematics of military power. Russia's population was 10 times larger than Sweden's. Russian territory contained resources that dwarfed Swedish capabilities. Russian determination, demonstrated through Peter's willingness to accept repeated defeats while continuing to rebuild his military forces, suggested a strategic patience that Swedish impetuosity could not match. Yet rather than seeking accommodation with this resurgent enemy, Charles began planning operations of unprecedented audacity and risk. The king, who had once shown remarkable strategic judgment in his campaigns against Denmark and Saxony, was now contemplating a direct invasion of Russia designed to eliminate the Tsarist regime and impose Swedish hegemony over Eastern Europe. It was a decision that revealed both the intoxicating effect of unbroken victory and the dangerous isolation from political reality that military success can produce. The strategic debate that preceded the Russian invasion demonstrated the evolution of Charles's relationship with his advisors and the growing influence of his own personality on Swedish policy. Experienced generals like Carl Gustav Renskold and Adam Ludwig Leuwenhaupt urged caution, pointing out the enormous logistical challenges involved in maintaining armies in Russian territory and the impossibility of achieving decisive victory against an enemy who could trade space for time. Swedish diplomats argued for negotiated settlement while Swedish advantages remained intact. But Charles had become convinced that only total victory could secure Swedish interests. Half measures and negotiated compromises would merely postpone the inevitable confrontation while allowing Russia to grow stronger. Better to strike now, while Swedish military superiority remained intact and Russian reforms had not yet reached completion. The logic was seductive, but it ignored crucial realities about the relationship between military means and political objectives. The invasion of Russia began in January 1708 with Swedish forces crossing the frozen Vistula River in conditions that would have challenged the endurance of any army. The temperature had dropped to 30 degrees below zero, cold enough to freeze weapons and make normal military operations impossible. Swedish soldiers, equipped with fur coats and felt boots acquired during their Polish campaigns, proved remarkably adaptable to these conditions. But the horses that carried Swedish cavalry and pulled Swedish artillery suffered terribly, with hundreds dying from exposure and exhaustion during the first weeks of the campaign. Charles himself seemed impervious to the hardships that decimated his army during the march eastward. The young king rode with his advance guards through snow-covered forests, slept in the open when no shelter could be found, and maintained the disciplined routine of planning and command that had characterized his entire career. His physical endurance had become legendary among both Swedish and enemy observers. Russian spies reported to Moscow that the Swedish king appeared to require no sleep, to eat only when reminded by his staff, and to show no awareness of cold that left hardened soldiers shivering around their fires. But personal heroism could not overcome the fundamental challenges posed by winter campaigning in hostile territory. Swedish supply lines, stretched across hundreds of miles of difficult terrain, became increasingly vulnerable to Russian attacks. Cossack irregulars, operating with local knowledge and unlimited mobility, struck repeatedly at Swedish communications, capturing supply convoys and eliminating isolated detachments. The systematic destruction of resources in Russian territory denied Swedish forces the local procurement that had sustained them during previous campaigns. The Russian strategy that emerged during 1708 represented Peter's maturation as a strategic thinker and his understanding of Russia's fundamental advantages over any European opponent. Rather than confronting Swedish forces directly in pitched battle, Russian armies adopted a strategy of strategic withdrawal combined with systematic devastation. Towns were evacuated and burned before Swedish arrival. Crops were destroyed and livestock driven away. Wells were poisoned and bridges demolished. The advancing Swedish army found itself marching through a desert created by deliberate Russian policy. This scorched earth strategy imposed psychological as well as material hardships on Swedish forces accustomed to living off the land and finding welcome among civilian populations. Polish peasants had often provided information and supplies to Swedish soldiers, viewing them as liberators from Saxon oppression. Russian peasants, by contrast, had been thoroughly prepared by government propaganda and religious instruction to regard Swedish forces as heretical invaders who deserved no quarter and should receive no assistance. The Battle of Haloxen, fought on July 4, 1708, demonstrated both Swedish tactical superiority and the strategic futility of their invasion. Russian forces, numbering nearly 16,000 men and positioned behind prepared earthworks, offered the kind of defensive battle that had been rare since Narva. Charles, recognizing an opportunity to inflict decisive defeat on a substantial enemy force, ordered immediate attack despite the obvious strength of Russian positions. The Swedish assault at Haloxen followed familiar patterns, with infantry advancing in perfect formation while artillery suppressed enemy defensive fire. But Russian resistance proved far more determined and effective than Swedish commanders had expected. Russian soldiers, no longer the demoralized conscripts who had fled at Narva, maintained their positions despite heavy casualties and fought with courage that impressed even their enemies. The battle lasted 6 hours and required repeated Swedish attacks before Russian lines finally broke. Victory at Haloxen inflicted heavy casualties on Russian forces and opened the road deeper into Russian territory. But it also revealed disturbing changes in the strategic balance that Swedish intelligence had not fully appreciated. Russian soldiers fought with discipline and determination that matched Swedish performance. Russian artillery, served by competent gunners, proved accurate and effective. Russian leadership, no longer dependent on foreign advisors, displayed tactical competence that made Swedish victory costly rather than inevitable. More ominously, Russian withdrawal after the battle followed orderly procedures that preserved unit cohesion and fighting effectiveness. This was not the panicked rout that had characterized previous Russian defeats, but the disciplined retreat of professional soldiers who remained capable of future resistance. The Russian army that Charles was pursuing remained intact and dangerous despite tactical defeat. The strategic decision that would ultimately doom the Swedish invasion came in late August 1708. When Charles chose to abandon his direct advance on Moscow in favor of a southern detour through Ukraine. This fateful choice was influenced by several factors that seemed compelling at the time but would prove disastrously mistaken. Ivan Mazepa, the Cossack hetman who controlled much of Ukraine, had promised to join the Swedish cause and provide the supplies and reinforcements that Charles desperately needed. Ukrainian resources, particularly the grain and livestock that could sustain Swedish armies through the coming winter, represented the difference between continued advance and strategic retreat. More importantly, Swedish control of Ukraine would threaten Russian communications with their southern territories and force Peter to divide his forces between multiple theaters. The strategic concept was sound, but its execution would depend on political developments beyond Swedish control. The march into Ukraine began in September 1708 as autumn rains turned Russian roads into rivers of mud that slowed Swedish movement and increased the suffering of men and animals already weakened by months of campaigning. Swedish soldiers, veterans of winter campaigns in Poland and Saxony, found Ukrainian conditions particularly challenging. The flat steppe country offered little natural shelter, while the sparse population meant that foraging opportunities were limited even when local inhabitants proved cooperative. Charles himself continued to display the remarkable stamina that had sustained him throughout his military career. The king rode with his advance guards, shared his soldiers' rations, and maintained the systematic attention to detail that had always characterized his leadership. But observers noted subtle changes in his behavior that suggested the enormous strain of continuous campaigning and command responsibility. He spoke less frequently with his officers, spent more time studying maps in apparent isolation, and showed increasing impatience with logistical constraints that limited his strategic options. The arrival of Mazepa's forces in October 1708 provided temporary relief for Swedish logistics but created new problems that Charles had not anticipated. The Cossack hetman brought fewer than 5,000 troops, far short of the substantial reinforcements he had promised. More seriously, Ukrainian popular support for Swedish alliance proved largely illusory. Most Ukrainian peasants remained loyal to the Orthodox faith that connected them to Moscow rather than the Protestant heresy they associated with Swedish rule. The devastating raid on Baturin in November 1708, conducted by Russian forces under Alexander Menshikov, eliminated the supply base that Mazepa had established for Swedish operations and demonstrated the fragility of Cossack support for Swedish alliance. The fortress that was supposed to provide winter quarters and equipment for Swedish forces was captured and destroyed before Charles could secure it, forcing Swedish armies to continue their increasingly desperate search for supplies and shelter. Winter quarters for the Swedish army during 1708 to 1709 became a nightmare of inadequate shelter, insufficient food, and brutal cold that tested human endurance to its absolute limits. Swedish soldiers, accustomed to harsh northern winters, found Ukrainian steppe conditions uniquely challenging. The flat landscape offered no protection from winds that seemed to cut through every layer of clothing. Fuel was scarce, forcing soldiers to burn furniture and wooden equipment to maintain fires that provided minimal warmth. Medical facilities, always inadequate during active campaigning, became completely overwhelmed by cases of frostbite, dysentery, and typhus that spread rapidly through units weakened by malnutrition and exposure. Swedish regimental surgeons, working without adequate supplies or proper facilities, could do little more than amputate frozen limbs and comfort dying soldiers. Entire companies disappeared during the Ukrainian winter, their members dead from disease and cold rather than enemy action. Charles seemed almost oblivious to the suffering of his army, spending long hours studying maps and planning spring operations that would complete the conquest of Russia. The king's apparent indifference to practical difficulties that consumed his subordinates reflected both his extraordinary personal toughness and his growing detachment from the realities that governed military operations. He continued to believe that Swedish tactical superiority would eventually prevail regardless of logistical disadvantages or numerical inferiority. The supply crisis that developed during the Ukrainian winter reached catastrophic proportions by early 1709, threatening the very survival of Swedish forces. Artillery horses died in such numbers that Swedish guns could no longer be moved. Infantry units, reduced to half their authorized strength by casualties and disease, could barely maintain perimeter security around their winter quarters. Officers, responsible for maintaining discipline and morale under impossible conditions, began to doubt whether their army would survive long enough to resume active operations. Relief was supposed to come from Adam Ludwig Lewenhaupt Corps, which had been operating in the Baltic provinces and was ordered to join Charles in Ukraine with desperately needed supplies and reinforcements. But Lewenhaupt's march southward became a fighting retreat against Russian forces that had learned to coordinate their operations and exploit Swedish vulnerabilities. The Battle of Lesnaya, fought on October 9, 1708, resulted in the destruction of most of Lewenhaupt's supply train and the elimination of his corps as an effective fighting force. News of Lesnaya reached Charles in his Ukrainian winter quarters like a death sentence for Swedish hopes in Russia. The supplies that were supposed to sustain Swedish operations through the winter and into the following campaign season were gone. The reinforcements that were supposed to restore Swedish numerical strength had been eliminated. Most seriously, the defeat demonstrated that Russian military capabilities had improved to the point where they could destroy veteran Swedish forces in conventional battle. Yet Charles refused to consider strategic withdrawal or negotiated settlement. The king, who had once demonstrated remarkable strategic judgment, was now committed to a course of action that defied both military logic and political reality. Spring would bring the final test of Swedish military power and the ultimate catastrophe that would destroy the empire Charles had inherited and the reputation he had built through 8 years of unbroken victory. Part 6. Poltava. The End of Swedish Dreams, 1709. The spring of 1709 arrived in Ukraine with deceptive gentleness, melting the snows that had tormented Swedish armies through the brutal winter and revealing the true extent of their degradation. What Charles had brought into Russia as the finest army in Europe had been reduced to fewer than 20,000 effective soldiers, many of them walking skeletons wrapped in the remnants of once proud uniforms. Swedish cavalry, once the terror of European battlefields, could barely mount their surviving horses. Artillery that had thundered across a dozen fields of victory now consisted of a handful of light guns pulled by soldiers who had eaten their horses to survive. Yet Charles himself seemed untouched by the disaster that surrounded him. The 27-year-old king maintained the same disciplined routine that had characterized his entire military career, rising before dawn to study intelligence reports and conduct the planning sessions that would determine Swedish operations. His uniform, though patched and faded, remained clean and properly maintained. His bearing retained the confident authority that had inspired Swedish armies through 8 years of warfare. Only his eyes, hollow with fatigue and burning with an intensity that concerned his subordinates, betrayed the enormous strain of command responsibility under impossible circumstances. The Swedish army that emerged from winter quarters in April 1709 was a ghost of its former self, sustained more by memory of past glory than realistic assessment of present capabilities. Regimental rolls that had once listed 800 names now contained fewer than 300 effectives. Officers who had begun the Russian campaign as company commanders now led battalions through battlefield promotion and the inexorable arithmetic of casualties. Equipment that had been the envy of European armies now consisted of whatever could be improvised from local materials or salvaged from battlefield debris. But Swedish morale, incredibly, remained intact despite material degradation that would have destroyed lesser armies. The soldiers who had survived the Ukrainian winter possessed a fierce pride in their own endurance and an almost religious faith in their king's ability to achieve victory regardless of odds. They had followed Charles from the Baltic to the Black Sea, had seen him lead cavalry charges and storm fortress walls, had watched him share their hardships and face their dangers. If the Lion of the North believed that victory was still possible, then victory must indeed be within reach. The decision to besiege Poltava represented Charles's final gamble on a strategy that had already failed in every essential respect. The fortress, located on the Vorskla River in eastern Ukraine, possessed no strategic value commensurate with the resources required to capture it. Its garrison, though substantial, posed no threat to Swedish operations. Its capture would provide no decisive advantage in the broader campaign to subdue Russian resistance. Yet Charles became obsessed with Poltava as a symbol of Swedish power and a demonstration that his army retained the capability to achieve its objectives. The siege began on May 1, 1709, with Swedish forces establishing positions around the fortress according to conventional procedures that ignored both their numerical weakness and their desperate shortage of artillery. Swedish engineers, working with inadequate tools and insufficient materials, began the laborious process of digging parallels and approaches that would bring assault troops within striking distance of Poltava's walls. But the mathematics of siegecraft, which required specific ratios of attackers to defenders and assumed adequate supplies of powder and shot, simply did not apply to Swedish circumstances. Peter the Great, observing Swedish commitment to the siege from his headquarters near Oposhnia, recognized the opportunity that Charles's obsession had created. The Swedish army that had once terrorized Russian forces through its mobility and unpredictability was now tied to fixed positions around Poltava, vulnerable to the kind of set-piece battle that Russian numerical superiority could win decisively. More importantly, Swedish forces were weakened by months of siege operations and had no possibility of strategic withdrawal if the battle turned against them. The Russian army that marched to relieve Poltava represented the culmination of Peter's military reforms and the transformation of Russian military culture that had begun with the disaster at Narva. Nearly 42,000 soldiers, organized in professional regiments and commanded by experienced officers, advanced with the confidence that came from recent victories and overwhelming material superiority. Russian artillery, served by competent gunners and equipped with modern weapons, outnumbered Swedish guns by more than 4 to 1. Russian cavalry, trained by foreign specialists and mounted on horses that had not been decimated by winter campaigning, possessed mobility that Swedish forces could no longer match. But numerical superiority alone did not explain Russian confidence as they approached the climactic battle of the Great Northern War. The army that Peter brought to Poltava had been forged through years of combat experience and systematic training that had created military capabilities equivalent to any European force. Russian soldiers no longer fled at the first sound of Swedish war cries. Russian officers no longer deferred to foreign advisors when making tactical decisions. Most importantly, Russian leadership had learned to coordinate complex military operations and exploit enemy weaknesses with the skill that had once been exclusively Swedish. Charles received reports of Russian approach with the calm acceptance that had characterized his response to every crisis throughout his military career. The Swedish king understood that the battle now approaching would determine not only the outcome of his Russian campaign but the fate of the Swedish Empire itself. Defeat at Poltava would mean the destruction of Swedish military power and the end of Sweden's position as a great European power. Victory, however unlikely given Swedish numerical weakness, might still salvage something from the wreckage of his strategic gamble. The injury that Charles sustained on June 17, when a Russian musket ball shattered his left foot during a reconnaissance mission, seemed to symbolize the deterioration of Swedish prospects as the decisive battle approached. The king, who had led countless cavalry charges and stormed fortress walls with apparent immunity to enemy fire, was suddenly reduced to helplessness, carried on a litter and unable to mount the horse that had carried him across the battlefields of Europe. Swedish soldiers, seeing their invincible leader wounded and incapacitated, began to whisper that their luck had finally changed. But Charles refused to allow physical incapacity to interfere with his command responsibilities or alter his determination to seek decisive battle with Russian forces. From his litter, he continued to issue detailed orders for Swedish deployment and tactical coordination. He insisted on being carried to forward positions where he could observe Russian movements and make final adjustments to Swedish battle plans. Most importantly, he maintained the confident bearing that Swedish soldiers expected from their king, showing no trace of doubt or fear despite circumstances that would have discouraged any rational commander. The Swedish battle plan for Poltava demonstrated both Charles's tactical genius and his complete detachment from the realities that governed his strategic situation. Unable to match Russian firepower or numerical strength in conventional engagement, he designed an attack that would neutralize Russian advantages through speed, surprise, and concentration of force at critical points. Swedish infantry, organized in assault columns rather than linear formations, would penetrate Russian fieldworks at predetermined locations while Swedish cavalry exploited gaps created by the foot soldiers. The plan was tactically sound and might have succeeded against the Russian armies that Charles had defeated at Narva or Holuxen. But it assumed Swedish capabilities that no longer existed and ignored Russian improvements that had transformed the strategic balance. Swedish soldiers, weakened by months of inadequate nutrition and decimated by disease and wounds, lacked the physical strength required for sustained assault against prepared positions. Swedish cavalry, mounted on horses that could barely walk, possessed none of the mobility that the plan required for success. The Battle of Poltava began at 4 o'clock on the morning of June 8, 1709, as Swedish assault columns advanced through morning mist toward Russian positions that bristled with artillery and swarmed with defenders. The initial Swedish attack achieved the tactical surprise that Charles had planned, penetrating Russian fieldworks at several points and creating momentary panic among troops who had not expected such aggressive action from a supposedly defeated enemy. But Swedish success proved impossible to exploit due to coordination failures and the simple physical exhaustion of soldiers who had given everything they possessed. Carl Gustav Renskold, commanding Swedish forces in Charles's absence, proved unable to maintain the complex timing that the battle plan required. Swedish columns, advancing across unfamiliar terrain in poor visibility, lost contact with each other and attacked piecemeal rather than in the coordinated assault that might have overwhelmed Russian defenses. Swedish artillery, reduced to 4 operational guns, could provide no effective support for infantry attacks that depended on suppressing enemy defensive fire. The collapse of Swedish assault formations marked the beginning of a disaster that would destroy not only Charles's army, but the entire strategic position that Sweden had built through a century of military innovation and battlefield success. Swedish soldiers, trapped between Russian fieldworks and unable to retreat across open ground swept by artillery fire, died in their ranks with the stoic courage that had always characterized Swedish arms. But courage alone could not overcome the mathematics of modern warfare when applied by competent enemies possessing overwhelming material superiority. Russian counterattacks, launched as Swedish assault momentum faltered, demonstrated tactical competence that would have impressed Gustavus Adolphus himself. Russian infantry, advancing in coordinated formations and supported by concentrated artillery fire, systematically destroyed Swedish units that had penetrated their positions. Russian cavalry, emerging from concealed positions, completed the destruction of Swedish forces that had managed to withdraw from the initial assault. Within 3 hours, the Swedish army that had terrorized Europe for nearly a decade had ceased to exist as an organized military force. Charles himself, carried on his litter to positions where he could observe the battle's progress, watched the systematic destruction of everything he had built with the same composed acceptance that had marked his response to every previous crisis. The young king who had never lost a battle was witnessing not merely tactical defeat but the complete collapse of Swedish power and the end of his own military career. Yet he showed no trace of panic or despair, continuing to issue orders and maintain the disciplined bearing that Swedish soldiers expected from their commander even in the moment of ultimate catastrophe. The aftermath of Poltava revealed the complete extent of Swedish defeat and the transformation of the European balance of power that would result from Charles's gamble on Russian conquest. Nearly 10,000 Swedish soldiers lay dead on the battlefield, while thousands more had been captured or scattered in flight. The artillery that had thundered across European battlefields for generations was lost, along with the regimental colors that represented centuries of Swedish military tradition. Most importantly, the aura of Swedish invincibility that had sustained Swedish diplomacy and deterred Swedish enemies had been shattered beyond repair. The flight from Poltava toward the Ottoman frontier marked the nadir of Swedish fortunes and the personal humiliation of a king who had never known defeat. Charles, still incapacitated by his wound and barely conscious from fever and exhaustion, was carried in a peasant cart along roads clogged with the remnants of his army. Swedish soldiers, still loyal despite the catastrophe that had befallen them, protected their king's retreat while knowing that their own military careers had ended in the Ukrainian steppes. The crossing of the Dnieper River on June 11th represented the final act of Swedish military involvement in the Great Northern War's Eastern Theater. Charles, accompanied by a few hundred survivors from the army that had once conquered half of Europe, entered Ottoman territory as a fugitive dependent on Turkish hospitality for his very survival. Behind him lay the wreckage of Swedish power and the certainty that the empire he had inherited would never recover from the disaster that his strategic miscalculations had produced. Peter the Great, surveying the battlefield where Swedish power had been destroyed, reportedly declared that the defeat of Charles XII marked Russia's transformation from European periphery to great power status. The Tsar who had fled ignominiously from Narva 8 years earlier was now master of Northern and Eastern Europe, while the king who had once seemed destined to reshape the European balance of power was reduced to exile and dependence on foreign charity. The Battle of Poltava had indeed changed everything, though not in ways that Charles XII had ever imagined possible. Part 7. Ottoman Exile. The King in the Wilderness, 1709 to 1714. The ancient city of Bender, perched on the banks of the Dniester River, where Moldavia met the vast Ottoman domains, had witnessed the passage of many exiles and refugees throughout its turbulent history. But never had it sheltered a guest quite like the one who arrived on July 1, 1709, carried in a peasant cart and accompanied by the scattered remnants of what had once been Europe's most formidable army. Charles XII of Sweden, 27 years old and until recently the terror of kings and emperors, had become a supplicant dependent on the hospitality of Sultan Ahmed III and the uncertain protection of Ottoman diplomacy. The contrast between Charles's former grandeur and his present circumstances could hardly have been more stark. The king who had dictated terms to Augustus the Strong and received ambassadors from Louis XIV now occupied modest quarters in a commandeered house, his court reduced to fewer than 1,000 Swedish officers and soldiers who had followed him into exile. The uniform that had once gleamed with gold braid and glittering decorations was now patched and faded, while the boots that had carried him across the battlefields of Europe were cracked and worn beyond repair. Yet Charles himself seemed remarkably unaffected by the material degradation that surrounded him. The same disciplined routine that had characterized his military campaigns continued in exile, with the king rising before dawn to conduct correspondence, study intelligence reports, and plan the diplomatic initiatives that might restore Swedish fortunes. His wound from Poltava had healed imperfectly, leaving him with a permanent limp and periodic pain that he bore with the stoic acceptance he had always shown toward physical discomfort. More significantly, his mental faculties remained sharp and his determination to continue the struggle against his enemies appeared undiminished. The Ottoman Empire that had granted Charles sanctuary was itself in a state of transition that would profoundly influence his prospects for future action. Sultan Ahmed III, who had assumed power in 1703, represented a generation of Ottoman leaders who sought to modernize their empire's military and administrative systems while maintaining traditional Islamic values and political structures. The Sultan's court in Constantinople combined traditional Ottoman ceremonial with intellectual curiosity about European developments and genuine interest in using Swedish expertise to advance Ottoman military capabilities. The initial Ottoman response to Charles's arrival reflected both genuine sympathy for a fellow monarch in distress and calculated assessment of the diplomatic advantages that Swedish alliance might provide. Ottoman relations with Russia had deteriorated steadily during Peter's reign, as Russian expansion in the Black Sea region threatened traditional Ottoman spheres of influence. Swedish military expertise, even in its currently degraded condition, represented a valuable resource for Ottoman armies that had suffered their own defeats at the hands of European enemies. More importantly, Charles's presence in Ottoman territory provided leverage for diplomatic initiatives designed to restore the European balance of power that Russian victories had disrupted. French diplomats, working through their extensive network of contacts in Constantinople, encouraged Ottoman support for Swedish restoration as part of a broader strategy to contain Russian expansion and limit Habsburg influence in southeastern Europe. The complex web of European alliances and antagonisms that had shaped the Great Northern War was thus extended into the Ottoman Empire, with Charles as both prize and player in diplomatic games whose outcome would determine the future of Eastern Europe. The Swedish court in exile that established itself at Bender bore little resemblance to the formal ceremonies that had characterized European monarchy, but it retained an atmosphere of dignified authority that impressed Ottoman observers. Charles maintained the same accessibility that had marked his relationship with Swedish officers throughout his military career, conducting business with a directness that contrasted sharply with Ottoman bureaucratic procedures. Swedish officers, despite their reduced circumstances, preserved the disciplined bearing that had made Swedish armies feared throughout Europe, while Swedish diplomatic representatives worked tirelessly to maintain contact with European capitals and coordinate resistance to the anti-Swedish coalition. The daily routine that Charles established in exile reflected both his unchanging personal habits and his determination to remain active in European affairs despite physical separation from the main theaters of conflict. Morning hours were devoted to correspondence with Swedish agents throughout Europe. Afternoon sessions focused on military planning and intelligence analysis, while evening meetings addressed the complex diplomatic negotiations required to maintain Ottoman support and coordinate Swedish policy with potential allies. The king's intellectual energy, denied its customary outlet in active campaigning, found expression in increasingly elaborate strategic concepts that extended far beyond Sweden's realistic capabilities. Turkish authorities, initially sympathetic to their royal guest, gradually became concerned about the implications of extended Swedish presence on Ottoman territory. Charles's obvious intention to use Ottoman resources for renewed military action against Russia threatened to involve the Ottoman Empire in conflicts that exceeded Turkish interests and capabilities. More seriously, Swedish attempts to coordinate anti-Russian activities with other European powers raised questions about Ottoman sovereignty and independence that could not be ignored indefinitely. The incident at the Kalkan, fought on July 21, 1711, demonstrated both the continued vitality of Swedish military thinking and the growing tension between Swedish ambitions and Ottoman policy. Charles had persuaded Grand Vizier Baltasi Mehmet Pasha to launch a major campaign against Russian forces operating in Moldavia, promising that Swedish expertise would ensure Ottoman victory and Russian withdrawal from the Black Sea region. The campaign initially achieved remarkable success, with Ottoman forces surrounding Peter the Great himself near the Prut River and creating the possibility of decisive Russian defeat. But the opportunity for total victory was lost when Baltasi Mehmet accepted Russian peace overtures instead of pressing his advantage to complete Russian destruction. Peter, trapped with a small army and facing certain defeat, offered territorial concessions and diplomatic agreements that satisfied immediate Ottoman concerns while preserving Russian power for future conflicts. The Treaty of the Prut, signed on July 23, 1711, represented a missed opportunity that would haunt Ottoman-Swedish relations for years to come. Charles's reaction to this diplomatic settlement revealed both his continued strategic insight and his growing detachment from political reality. The Swedish king correctly recognized that Ottoman acceptance of limited Russian concessions represented a fundamental abandonment of anti-Russian policy and the beginning of Ottoman accommodation with the new balance of power in Eastern Europe. But his response to this development demonstrated the same inflexibility that had characterized his rejection of negotiated settlements throughout the Great Northern War. Rather than adapting Swedish policy to changed circumstances or seeking alternative approaches to the restoration of Swedish power, Charles became increasingly insistent that his Ottoman hosts resume active military operations against Russia regardless of Ottoman interests or capabilities. This position, while consistent with Swedish strategic requirements, ignored Ottoman political realities and created tensions that would eventually make continued Swedish presence in Ottoman territory impossible. The years of exile that followed the Prut campaign transformed Charles from honored guest to increasingly unwelcome burden for Ottoman authorities who found themselves caught between Swedish demands and the practical requirements of Ottoman policy. The Swedish court at Bender, initially viewed as a valuable source of military expertise and diplomatic leverage, became seen as a complication that interfered with Ottoman relations with other European powers while providing diminishing returns in terms of practical advantage. Charles himself seemed oblivious to the changing atmosphere surrounding his exile, continuing to pursue diplomatic initiatives and military plans that assumed Ottoman support which was no longer forthcoming. The king's intellectual isolation from European political developments became increasingly apparent as his correspondence revealed strategic concepts that bore little relationship to actual conditions in the theaters where Swedish interests were at stake. Swedish armies in the Baltic provinces were being systematically destroyed by Russian forces, Swedish territories were being occupied by enemy powers, and Swedish allies were defecting to the anti-Swedish coalition, but Charles continued to plan operations that assumed resources and support that no longer existed. The economic burden that Swedish exile imposed on Ottoman resources became another source of tension between host and guest. Charles and his followers, despite their reduced circumstances, required substantial support for their maintenance while contributing little to Ottoman military or economic capabilities. The Swedish court's expenses, modest by the standards of European monarchy but significant for Ottoman provincial administration, represented a constant drain on local resources while providing no corresponding benefit to Ottoman interests. More seriously, Charles's continued presence at Bender created diplomatic complications that threatened Ottoman relations with major European powers. Russian complaints about Ottoman harboring of Swedish forces became increasingly vociferous as Swedish agents operating from Ottoman territory coordinated resistance activities in occupied Swedish territories. Austrian and Prussian diplomatic representatives expressed concern about Swedish attempts to organize anti-Habsburg coalitions using Ottoman territory as a base. French support for Swedish exile gradually diminished as Louis XIV's own strategic priorities shifted away from Northern European concerns. The personal transformation that Charles underwent during his years of exile reflected both the extraordinary stresses of his situation and his remarkable psychological resilience. The young king who had entered Ottoman territory as a defeated fugitive gradually adapted to circumstances that would have broken lesser men. His physical appearance changed dramatically, with the elegant uniforms of his military career replaced by simpler Ottoman-influenced dress that reflected both practical necessity and cultural adaptation. His command of Turkish, initially non-existent, became sufficiently fluent for direct communication with Ottoman officials. But the most significant change in Charles during his exile was the evolution of his strategic thinking from the pragmatic flexibility that had characterized his early campaigns to an increasingly rigid adherence to concepts that bore little relationship to changing political and military realities. The king who had once demonstrated remarkable ability to adapt tactics and strategy to changing circumstances became fixated on achieving total victory through means that no longer existed. His plans for renewed military action assumed Swedish capabilities that had been destroyed at Poltava and international support that had evaporated with Swedish military defeat. The intellectual isolation that characterized Charles's later years in exile was compounded by his growing disconnection from reliable sources of information about European developments. Swedish intelligence networks, disrupted by military defeat and territorial occupation, provided increasingly fragmentary and outdated reports about conditions in Sweden and other theaters of the Great Northern War. Ottoman sources, while extensive, reflected Turkish concerns and perspectives that differed significantly from Swedish interests and requirements. The diplomatic isolation that accompanied Charles's physical exile became increasingly apparent as European powers began to view him as an irrelevant relic of conflicts that were moving toward resolution without Swedish participation. The Congress of Utrecht, which addressed the settlement of the War of Spanish Succession, proceeded without Swedish representation or consideration of Swedish interests. The various bilateral negotiations that were reshaping the map of Northern Europe treated Sweden as a defeated power whose territorial losses could be distributed among the victors without reference to Swedish claims or preferences. By 1713, it had become clear to all parties that Charles's continued presence in Ottoman territory served no useful purpose for any of the governments involved. The Swedish king's refusal to accept negotiated settlement of the Great Northern War on terms that acknowledged Swedish defeat made him an obstacle to the general European peace that other powers were seeking to establish. Ottoman authorities, facing their own military and financial challenges, could no longer afford to maintain Swedish exile while gaining no corresponding advantage for Ottoman interests. The confrontation that finally ended Charles's Ottoman exile began as a minor dispute over debts and privileges, but escalated into armed conflict that demonstrated both the king's continued fighting spirit and the impossibility of his position. Turkish troops, ordered to restrict Swedish movements and reduce the costs of Swedish maintenance, encountered resistance from Swedish guards who interpreted these measures as violations of their king's dignity and safety. The resulting skirmish, fought in the courtyard of Charles's residence on February 1, 1713, saw the Swedish king personally leading his handful of followers in desperate hand-to-hand combat against Ottoman janissaries. The image of Charles XII fighting with sword and pistol against overwhelming odds in defense of his diminished court provided a fitting symbol for his entire career. Magnificent in its courage and futility, heroic in its defiance of impossible circumstances, and ultimately tragic in its disconnection from achievable objectives. The king who had once commanded the finest army in Europe was reduced to street fighting with a few dozen loyal followers against former allies who had grown weary of his presence and his demands. Part 8. The Return of the Lion Final Campaigns and Death, 1714 to 1718. The journey from Bender to Stockholm that began in the autumn of 1714 covered more than geography. It spanned the distance between the grandiose dreams that had driven Charles into exile and the grim realities that awaited him in a homeland transformed by defeat and occupation. The king who had left Sweden 15 years earlier at the head of Europe's finest army returned alone, riding incognito through territories that had once trembled at the mention of his name but now barely remembered the glory of Swedish arms. Charles traveled in disguise through a continent that had been reshaped by his absence, using forged papers and assumed identities to avoid recognition by the enemies who now controlled much of what had once been Swedish territory. The route that carried him from Ottoman domains through Habsburg lands and German principalities to the Baltic coast provided a comprehensive tour of Swedish losses and European transformation. Cities that had once sent tribute to Stockholm now flew Danish, Russian, or Prussian flags. Fortresses that had once anchored Swedish defensive lines lay in ruins or housed enemy garrisons. Most painfully, Swedish territories that had been prosperous and secure when he departed were now devastated by years of warfare and foreign occupation. The Sweden that Charles found upon his arrival in November 1714 bore little resemblance to the confident kingdom he had inherited 18 years earlier. The population, reduced by military casualties and economic dislocation, struggled to maintain agricultural production and urban commerce under the crushing burden of war taxation and foreign invasion. Swedish armies, once the terror of European battlefields, had been systematically destroyed in a series of defeats that followed Poltava with depressing regularity. Swedish territories, stretching from Finland to the German coast, had been occupied by enemies who showed no inclination to restore them regardless of future peace negotiations. Most seriously, Swedish finances had collapsed under the strain of maintaining military forces and diplomatic initiatives that consumed resources without producing corresponding strategic advantages. The treasury that had once seemed inexhaustible was empty, the credit that had sustained Swedish operations was exhausted, and the economic base that supported Swedish power had been systematically eroded by blockade and occupation. The kingdom that Charles had left as the dominant power in Northern Europe had been reduced to a second-rate state whose survival depended on the forbearance of enemies who had every reason to complete Sweden's destruction. Yet Charles himself appeared remarkably unchanged by the disasters that had befallen his kingdom during his absence. The 32-year-old king who returned to Stockholm retained the physical vigor and intellectual energy that had characterized his youth, while his determination to restore Swedish power seemed undiminished by repeated defeats and overwhelming odds. He immediately threw himself into the task of military reconstruction with the same methodical thoroughness that had marked his approach to earlier campaigns, studying intelligence reports, interviewing commanders, and assessing the resources available for renewed military action. The army that Charles began assembling for his final campaigns reflected both Swedish military traditions and the harsh realities imposed by defeat and economic collapse. Veteran regiments that had once numbered thousands of men were reduced to company strength, their ranks filled by conscripts who lacked the training and experience of their predecessors. Equipment that had once been standardized and of the highest quality was now improvised from whatever materials could be obtained through local production or foreign purchase. Officers who had once commanded battalions now led platoons, their tactical knowledge intact but their resources insufficient for effective military action. But Swedish morale, surprisingly, remained intact despite material deficiencies that would have discouraged any rational assessment of military prospects. The soldiers who rallied to Charles's standard possessed an almost religious faith in their king's ability to achieve victory regardless of circumstances. They had heard stories of Narva and Haloxin, of Klisso and the march into Russia, told and retold around campfires until they assumed the character of legend. If the Lion of the North believed that Sweden could still prevail against its enemies, then victory must indeed be possible through Swedish courage and tactical superiority. The strategic situation that confronted Charles upon his return offered few options for effective military action but demanded immediate decisions to prevent complete Swedish collapse. Russian armies, now numbering in the hundreds of thousands and equipped with modern weapons, occupied Finland and threatened Swedish territory proper. Danish forces controlled former Swedish territories in Skane and prepared for invasion of Swedish heartland. Prussian and Hanoverian armies administered former Swedish possessions in Germany as if they were permanent acquisitions rather than temporary occupations. Most ominously, the international diplomatic situation had evolved in directions that made Swedish restoration increasingly unlikely regardless of military outcomes. The Congress of Vienna, addressing the general settlement of European conflicts, was proceeding without meaningful Swedish participation and seemed inclined to treat Swedish territorial losses as permanent transfers to be confirmed by international agreement. European powers that had once feared Swedish expansion now viewed Swedish recovery as an undesirable disruption of the balance they were attempting to establish. Charles's response to these overwhelming challenges demonstrated both his continued strategic insight and his fatal inability to accept the limitations that circumstances imposed on Swedish capabilities. Rather than seeking negotiated settlement that might preserve Swedish independence while acknowledging territorial losses, he began planning military operations designed to restore Swedish power through renewed demonstration of tactical superiority and strategic audacity. The king who had once possessed the resources to implement such ambitious concepts now attempted to achieve similar objectives with means that were wholly inadequate to the task. The decision to invade Norway in 1716 represented Charles's final attempt to reverse Swedish decline through the kind of bold military action that had once brought him spectacular success. Norway, united with Denmark but geographically separated from Danish territory, appeared vulnerable to Swedish attack and might provide the territorial compensation that would offset Swedish losses elsewhere. More importantly, Norwegian conquest would demonstrate that Swedish military capabilities remained formidable despite recent defeats, and might encourage other European powers to reconsider their dismissive attitude towards Swedish restoration. The Norwegian campaign that began in March 1716 revealed both Charles's tactical brilliance and the strategic impossibility of his position. Swedish forces, numbering fewer than 20,000 men, but led by officers who understood their profession thoroughly, achieved remarkable initial success against Norwegian and Danish defenders who had grown complacent during years of Swedish weakness. The siege of Christiania, conducted with mathematical precision despite inadequate artillery and insufficient supplies, demonstrated that Swedish military traditions remained alive despite material deficiencies. But tactical success could not overcome the fundamental imbalance between Swedish resources and Swedish objectives that had plagued Charles throughout his career. Norwegian resistance, initially weak and disorganized, strengthened as Danish reinforcements arrived and local militia units gained confidence through experience. British naval intervention, designed to prevent Swedish disruption of Baltic trade, eliminated Swedish maritime communications and made sustained operations in Norwegian territory impossible. Most seriously, Russian advances in Finland threatened Swedish territory proper and made concentration of Swedish forces in Norway strategically dangerous. The withdrawal from Norway in December 1716 marked another in the series of strategic defeats that had characterized Swedish operations since Poltava, but Charles refused to acknowledge the implications of continued failure or modify his objectives accordingly. The king, who had once demonstrated remarkable ability to adapt his methods to changing circumstances, now pursued policies that bore no relationship to Swedish capabilities or European political realities. His plans for renewed Norwegian operations assumed resources that did not exist and international support that would not be forthcoming. The Swedish court during Charles's final years reflected the same disconnection from reality that characterized royal policy. Courtiers who might have provided honest assessment of Swedish prospects feared to contradict their king's optimistic evaluations, while foreign diplomats reporting on Swedish conditions were dismissed as enemy agents spreading defeatist propaganda. The intellectual isolation that had begun during Charles's Ottoman exile continued in Stockholm, where accurate information about European developments was filtered through the lens of Swedish wishful thinking. The personal transformation that Charles had undergone during years of defeat and exile became increasingly apparent to those who had known him during his period of victory and expansion. The young king, who had once listened carefully to experienced advisors, now rejected counsel that contradicted his preconceptions. The commander, who had once adapted his tactics to enemy capabilities, now relied on methods that had been successful in different circumstances against different opponents. Most tragically, the monarch, who had once understood the relationship between military means and political objectives, now pursued victory as an end in itself, regardless of the costs or consequences. The final Norwegian campaign that began in 1718 represented Charles's last attempt to achieve the military success that might restore Swedish power and his own reputation. Norwegian targets that had seemed attainable during the previous campaign remained strategically significant, while Swedish resources, though depleted by continued warfare, were sufficient for limited operations that might yield decisive results. More importantly, Charles himself seemed determined to stake everything on one final gamble that would either restore Swedish greatness or end the struggle in which he had invested his entire adult life. The march into Norway during the autumn of 1718 followed familiar patterns, with Swedish columns advancing through difficult terrain against defending forces that fought with increasing determination. The siege of Fredrikstad, a fortress that commanded strategic approaches to Norwegian population centers, began in late November with Swedish forces establishing positions according to conventional procedures. But the mathematics of siegecraft, which required specific relationships between attacking and defending forces, worked against Swedish success in circumstances where every aspect of military action demanded superior resources. Charles himself seemed driven by a fatalistic determination that impressed even his enemies with its mixture of courage and futility. The king, who had once commanded the finest army in Europe, now personally supervised the digging of siege trenches and the positioning of artillery pieces. He shared his soldiers' rations, slept in their rough shelters, and exposed himself to enemy fire with the same disregard for personal safety that had characterized his youth. But the physical vigor that had once seemed inexhaustible now showed signs of the strain imposed by 20 years of continuous warfare and the weight of repeated defeats. On the evening of November 30th, 1718, exactly 18 years after his victory at Narva had announced his emergence as a military genius, Charles XII conducted his final inspection of Swedish siege works around Fredrikstad. The 46-year-old king moved through the trenches with the same methodical thoroughness that had always characterized his approach to military problems, checking artillery positions and discussing tactical details with officers who had served him faithfully through decades of triumph and disaster. The single musket shot that ended Charles's life at approximately 9 o'clock that evening created a mystery that has never been definitively resolved. Whether the bullet came from a Norwegian defender, a disaffected Swedish soldier, or an assassin hired by political enemies remained subjects for speculation and investigation that would continue for centuries. What was certain was that the Lion of the North had died as he had lived, facing forward toward enemy positions and sharing the dangers that threatened his soldiers. The silence that followed Charles's death seemed to spread from the muddy trenches around Fredrikstad to encompass all of Northern Europe. The king, who had shaped the political geography of an entire continent through 2 decades of warfare, was gone, leaving behind a kingdom reduced to impotence and a legend that would inspire contradictory interpretations for generations to come. Some would remember him as the last of the warrior kings, a heroic figure who had carried the traditions of medieval chivalry into the modern age. Others would see him as a cautionary example of military genius divorced from political wisdom, a commander whose tactical brilliance had been undermined by strategic miscalculation and personal inflexibility. But perhaps Charles XII was best understood as a transitional figure, representing the end of one historical epoch and the beginning of another. The world into which he had been born in 1682 was still dominated by personal monarchy, dynastic warfare, and the belief that military action could reshape political arrangements according to royal will. The world that emerged after his death in 1718 would be increasingly shaped by national interests, balance of power diplomacy, and the understanding that military force must serve achievable political objectives. The Lion of the North had roared his defiance at a changing world that no longer responded to the ancient calls of honor, glory, and royal prerogative. In the snow-covered trenches around an obscure Norwegian fortress, the last of the Viking kings had finally found the peace that had eluded him throughout a life devoted to the pursuit of victory that always seemed to slip away just as it appeared within reach. The age of Charles XII was over, but the legend of the warrior king who never learned to retreat would echo through the centuries like the sound of Swedish war drums fading into the northern night.